and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today we'll be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 15th January 2019. The articles to be discussed today are reflected on your screen, and the timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So let's begin. This news has been taken from page number 5 and is talking about the nod given by the Union Ministry of Tourism for the creation of a third spiritual circuit in Kerala under the Swadesh Darshan scheme. Therefore, in our discussion today, we'll be talking about what is the Swadesh Darshan scheme and the needs and the objectives of the same scheme. Now, if you've been analyzing previous year UPSC papers, you would realize that schemes and government initiatives form a very crucial part of your examination, especially the prelims. Every year, consistently, UPSC has been asking questions from various schemes, with the variation of almost 10 questions being asked in the year 2016 to almost 1 to 2 questions which have been asked in 2018, 17, 15, etc. Therefore, this Swadesh Darshan scheme is important for your prelims, especially in the area of economic development. Before we discuss what exactly entails in the Swadesh Darshan scheme, we first need to know the background or the exact need why a scheme like Swadesh Darshan was required in the first place. Now, India has a very rich cultural, historical, religious, as well as a natural heritage. And these heritage provide a huge potential for development of tourism in our country. Tourism itself is one of the most important pillars of infrastructure and economic development in our country because it directly leads to job creation. Realizing this potential which the tourism sector has, government has now come out with a specific flagship scheme to develop tourist circuits all across our country to attract both domestic as well as foreign tourists. The Swadesh Darshan scheme is a flagship scheme of the Ministry of Tourism. Secondly, this scheme is a central sector scheme. This is what you need to remember, that as far as the funding is concerned, this is a central sector scheme. A central sector scheme is the one in which both the funding as well as the implementation of the scheme is 100% borne out by the state. Hence, the Swadesh Darshan scheme is also funded and implemented both by the central government and not by the state government. The other kind of scheme is a centrally sponsored scheme in which both the central and the state government bear the funding expenses in certain ratio. Usually it's 70-30, that is 70 for the center and 30 for the state. Or it can also be 90-10, especially in the case of northeastern state. Now, the major aim or the objective of the Swadesh Darshan scheme is the integrated development of theme-based tourist circuits in our country. The first word here is integrated. What we mean by integrated is that this scheme envisages to synergize with other Government of India schemes like the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, Skill India, Make in India, etc. Hence, this Swadesh Darshan scheme would work in synergy with the other ministries of the Government of India. Therefore, though the implementing authority is the Union Tourism Ministry, but this scheme will work in coordination with other ministries as well. The second aspect is theme-based tourist circuit. A tourist circuit is defined as a route which has at least 3 major tourist spots which are both distinct and apart. Say, for example, across a stretch of 500 kilometers, we have at least 3 tourist destinations which say lie almost 150 kilometers apart from each other. And further, these tourist destinations also have to be distinct. That is, they can belong to different faiths or different culture. Therefore, if any such kind of circuit or route is present, then that entire area would be developed into a tourist circuit. Further, this tourist circuit again is theme-based. That is, instead of developing one particular site or one particular area, what the government is trying to do is that they have identified certain broad theme, and according to that theme, they have now started developing tourist destinations which are connected to that theme. So currently, the government has identified 15 thematic circuits all across India. Example of some of these themes would be Buddhist, ecology, Himalaya, tribal, rural, Krishna, northeast, desert, coastal, etc. One more thing which you need to remember is that under this scheme, the funding varies from state to state. Usually what happens is that under a central sector scheme, the funds which the central government allocates for the various states is almost same. But since this scheme is based on thematic circuits, therefore the funding under this scheme varies from state to state. Further, this funding depends upon the detailed project reports which the various committees submit to the Union Tourism Ministry. In the past few months also, the Swadesh Darshan scheme has been in news because in September 2018, the first tribal circuit in our country was inaugurated in the state of Chhattisgarh. So you just need to remember that the first tribal circuit was inaugurated in Chhattisgarh. In addition to Chhattisgarh, the government has commissioned the development of tribal circuits even in the state of Nagaland and Telangana. Like mentioned in the beginning, this current news has occurred because in the state of Kerala also, a third spiritual circuit is now being constructed. You do not need to know what these circuits are. Just remember that in Kerala, a third spiritual circuit has now been commissioned. Then in November also, in Arunachal Pradesh, 2 northeast circuits were inaugurated. This is just for your basic understanding that since 2014, when the scheme was commissioned, the government had started working on various circuits, and now one by one these circuits have been completed and now are being inaugurated. Therefore, a tribal circuit has already been inaugurated in the state of Chhattisgarh and a northeast circuit was inaugurated in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. Now, in the beginning of our discussion only, I mentioned that UPSC constantly asks various questions from government schemes and initiatives. It is not possible to discuss all of such schemes, but just to give you an example of how questions are framed, we'll take this question from the year 2018, which was asked in reference to the Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana. The first statement directly asks that this scheme comes under which ministry. Therefore, now we know understanding which ministry a certain scheme comes under is important. The statement reads, it is a flagship scheme of the Ministry of Labour and Employment. This statement was incorrect. It is a flagship scheme of the Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship. Second, it, among other things, will also impart training in soft skills, entrepreneurship, financial and digital literacy. This was right. Thus, the second statement is talking about the objective of the referred scheme. Third, it aims to align the competencies of the unregulated workforce of the country to the National Skill Qualification Framework. This statement was correct. Third statement again talks about aims. Thus, usually when UPSC asks questions from schemes, their focus is the respective ministry under which that scheme comes, the aims and objective of that scheme, the funding of that scheme, that is whether it is a centrally sponsored or a central sector scheme, and sometimes UPSC also asks you a unique feature, if at all there exists, in relation to that scheme. For example, this third point here, in addition to being a name, was also a unique feature. Based on a discussion of the Swadesh Darshan scheme, here is a prelims practice question. Please pause the video and solve it. We'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. The first statement, it is a flagship scheme of the Ministry of Tourism. This is correct. Second, it is a centrally sponsored scheme. This is incorrect. It is not a centrally sponsored scheme, but is rather a central sector scheme. Third, it aims to develop religious tourist sites across India. This is incorrect. It aims to develop thematic tourist circuits and not particular sites in India. Now, this third option, that is developing religious tourist sites across India, is an objective of another scheme from the Ministry of Tourism known as the Prasad scheme. Prasad stands for Pilgrimage Rejuvenation and Spirituality Augmentation Drive. Under the Prasad scheme, various religious sites and cities have been selected which are now being developed into a religious tourist spot. Hence, the right answer to this question is A, one only. With this, let's move on to our next news. This next news is an editorial taken from page number 8 and is in the context of sedition. The context of this news is that a sedition case has been registered against noted public intellectual and Sahitya Academy Award winner Hiren Gohain by the Assam Police for his remarks against the Citizenship Amendment Bill of 2016 as well as his possible demand for independence and sovereignty of Assam. In this editorial, basically, author is highlighting that registering a sedition case amounts to its gross misuse by the state authorities. Therefore, in this background, let us know a few details about sedition. Now, we find the definition of sedition in the Indian Penal Code under the section 124A. Section 124A reads, and I quote, whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by signs, or by visible representation or otherwise, brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite disaffection towards the government established by law, shall be punished with imprisonment for life, to which fine may be added, or with imprisonment which may extend to 3 years, to which fine may be added, or with fine. Now, what you need to remember is that sedition means any person who by words, now these words can be both written or oral, or even by signs or any kind of visible representation, wants to bring hatred or contempt or wants to bring disaffection towards the established government, then that person will be punished with imprisonment for life or imprisonment up till 3 years in addition to fine or only with fine. The section further provides us with certain kind of explanation, and it says the expression disaffection towards the government means disloyalty and feeling of enmity towards the government. That is, if anyone is trying to excite any kind of disloyalty towards the established government, or they are encouraging anybody against the government by harboring feelings of enmity or hatred, then that would amount to sedition. Further, the explanation also says any kind of comments which express disapprobation. Disapprobation means condemnation. Thus, what it means, any kind of comments which expresses a person's dissatisfaction or disapproval with the measures of the government will not amount to sedition if such comments were made so that the government can take in the positive criticism and alter that measure, and if that comments were made without an intention to excite hatred, contempt or disaffection towards the government. In gist, what it means is that healthy criticism of the government policies so that the laws and the measures can be changed will not amount to sedition. Third explanation reads, comments expressing disapprobation of the administrative or other action of the government without exciting or attempting to excite hatred, contempt or disaffection do not constitute offense under this section. So explanation third also says that any kind of healthy criticism or a mere disappointment or disapproval with the administrative or other action of the government is made, then that too would not amount to sedition. The difference between the second and the third explanation is that under second explanation, the comments have been made so that the laws or the measures by the government can be altered. In the third explanation, comments or remarks have been made against the normal administrative or any other executive action of the government. As far as the Supreme Court's take on sedition is concerned, the Supreme Court of India in the case of Kedarnath versus the state of Bihar, a 1962 case, had upheld the constitutional validity of section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, which relates to sedition. But the court also specifically mentioned that the provisions of sedition should not be used arbitrarily on the whims and fancies of the state authorities. Further, the court held that a person can be prosecuted for sedition only if his acts caused violence or public disorder. That is, unless an act of a person does not really cause some kind of violence or public disorder or enmity towards the government, then that person cannot be booked on the grounds of sedition. Thus, a mere apprehension in the mind of the authorities that the acts of a person will lead to violence or will lead to public disorder or any kind of enmity towards the government is not enough. Actual causation of that violence and public order is required. Now, the issue about sedition is that it contradicts Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution, which talks about freedom of speech and expression. Therefore, the entire debate is Section 124A of the IPC vis-a-vis Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution. For majority of people, sedition is seen as a reprehensible measure to stop political dissent and alternative view. Further, it is felt that a citizen of a country has the right to gather information on the various policies and measures of the government and then voice their concern in the form of disapproval or disappointment in case they find something incongruent with the policy. The reason is that dissent and criticism of the government are very essential ingredients of a robust public debate. Thus, in a vibrant democracy, if a country is not open to positive criticism, then there is a very little difference left between the pre- and the post-independence era of India. Because even in the pre-independence India, the citizens were not allowed to criticize the British government. And even after independence, due to section 124A of the IPC, people today still cannot carry out any positive or healthy criticism against the government policies. Hence, sedition should not be misused as a tool to curb free speech in our country. Further, in a democracy, towing the line of the government or singing from the same songbook is not a benchmark for patriotism. That is, simply being a yes man to the government's policy is no sign of patriotism. In a democracy, people have the liberty to show their patriotism or affection towards their country in their own individual manner. Hence, an expression of frustration over the state of affairs of the government cannot be treated as sedition. Thus, in the lights of these arguments, it's rightly said that dissent is the safety valve of a democracy. The justification for the law of sedition is found under Article 19, Clause 2, which puts certain limitation on a citizen's freedom of speech and expression. Article 19.2 says that the government has the right to put certain embargoes on the freedom of speech and expression on the grounds of sovereignty and integrity of India. Secondly, if the security of the state is in question. Third, if it goes against public order or decency. And also, if it's in relation to contempt, defamation, or incitement to an offense, then too, the government can put reasonable restrictions on the freedom of speech and expression. Therefore, looking at the security of the state, the public order, integrity of India, as well as incitement to an offense, various authorities again and again arbitrarily misuse Section 124A of the IPC, that is sedition, to curb any kind of dissent or an alternative view which is opposed to any government action or policy. Based on a discussion on sedition, please try solving this mains practice question, which reads, dissent is the safety valve of democracy. In the light of the statement, critically analyze the sedition laws in our country. And with this, let's move on to our next news. This next news appears on page number 13, and it reads that the Union Ministry of Civil Aviation is all set to award new regional connectivity routes under the Udan 3 initiative. So in this regard, let us understand some details about the Udan scheme. But as far as the syllabus is concerned, in the prelims it will form a part of your economic initiatives, and in your mains it will come under GS paper 3 in the subtopic of issues related to Indian economy, growth and development. Now currently, there are around 400 unserved airstrips in India which have no commercial flights operating on them, as well as there are around 20 underserved airports in our country. Therefore, there is a need to make optimum use of these unserved airstrips and these 20 underserved airports in order to promote balanced regional development in our country. Therefore, the main objective of Udan, or the need why Udan was needed, was because the government wanted to promote a balanced regional development in India. Therefore, Udan wants to put Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities on the aviation map of our country. That means that under Udan, all the Tier 2 and the Tier 3 cities will be connected with the rest of the country through airlines or the aviation route. Also, since for a lot of airline companies, to operate on such routes might not be financially viable, therefore under the Udan scheme, it was also required that the government should provide some kind of incentive to these airlines to ply on such routes. That is, to ply on routes which are not commercially viable for the airlines. So the Udan scheme is under Ministry of Civil Aviation. Like mentioned, Udan is the government's initiative to make air travel to India's Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities much more affordable and to put smaller and remote regions on the aviation map. So under the scheme, government basically offers incentives to the airlines to fly off new flights to remote or the neglected cities of our country. This the government does by providing what is known as the viability gap funding. We'll come to viability gap funding later. Coming to Udan, this scheme is applicable on the route length between 200 to 800 kilometers. That is, if an airline is flying anywhere between 200 to 8 kilometers, connecting any remote, smaller or neglected city of our country, then the Ministry of Civil Aviation under the Udan scheme will try to incentivize such airlines by providing them with viability gap funding. Now, how the process of Udan actually works is that the government will call in the airlines to bid for exclusive rights to fly on these regional routes. For example, Indigo says that I can fly a particular route with 20% gap funding. Go Air says I can do it in 15%, and SpiceJet says I can do it at 10%. So since SpiceJet has the lowest bid, the government will provide SpiceJet with exclusive right to fly on such routes. By such routes, we mean the regional routes which are being bid under this Udan scheme. Now, for example, say under the scheme, SpiceJet will fly flights from Delhi to Hubli. Now assume on this flight there are total of 40 seats. Now the SpiceJet has to reserve certain seats, for example say 30 seats as Udan seats, and the other 10 it can sell to other people at market price. So under the Udan scheme, the flight seats have a fixed fare of 2500 rupees per hour of travelling. Now let's imagine that the actual market price, that is the normal price which the airline would incur if it flies from Delhi to Hubli, would be say 7500 rupees. But under Udan, it has to sell the seat for 2500 rupees. So this gap between 7500 rupees and 2500 rupees, that is rupees 5000, is what is the viability gap funding. That is now the government would pay for this extra 5000 rupees to the airlines because they have incurred a loss, as the actual market price was 7500, but under Udan they sold the seats for 2500 rupees. The Udan seats are served on first come first basis. Therefore, the difference between the market price and the Udan price is what is viability gap funding. The logic behind viability gap funding is that some projects may not be financially viable, though they are economically justified and very necessary. And thus, for successful completion of such project, the government has designed viability gap funding. That is, it grants financial support to these projects which are not really financially viable. So the airlines are basically compensated by the center as well as the state governments for the losses that is incurred by them, wherein the center would contribute 80% of that loss and the state would contribute 20% of that loss. Hence, 80% cost of the VGF, that is the viability gap funding, is borne out by the center and 20% cost is borne out by the state. Moving ahead, you also need to remember that in order to increase the viability of these regional airports, the government has abolished airport charges and has also reduced the excise duty on aviation turbine fuel. Now, very recently, the government has also proposed an international Udan, the main objective of which would be to connect smaller Indian cities directly with key foreign destinations. Earlier, what used to happen, people had to come to major international airports in case they wish to fly outside India. But under International Udan, the government wants to connect these smaller cities directly with very important foreign destination in our neighborhood. Now, as per the guidelines of International Udan, it is stated that it is the state government that will provide financial support for International Udan. Based on a discussion, here is a prelims practice question. Please try and solve this and we'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. With reference to Udan scheme, consider the following statements. A. Government provides subsidy to the airline operators to operate commercial flights to all major routes in India. This is incorrect. Udan is not for major routes, but for all those airline routes which connect remote or neglected cities. Second, under International Udan, the state government shall provide subsidy to commercial flights to international destination. This is correct. Hence, the right answer is B, 2 only. With this, let's move on to our next news. The next article appears on page number 18 and is talking about a report by the United Nations according to which desalination plants have harmful effect on the environment. From its syllabus, it will form a part of GS paper 3 under the category of environment and subtopic of conservation and environmental pollution. As per the UN report, the desalination plants, which were initially installed to manage water scarcity problem globally, now are having a very toxic effect on the environment. Desalination is the process of removing salt from water. Usually the water itself is salty, thus the process of removing excessive salt from a salty water is what is known as desalination. Now globally, it is estimated that almost 2 billion people in the world live in an area of water scarcity. Therefore, installation of desalination plants becomes very important to cater to the water needs of such people. 50% of these desalination plants are basically located in Middle East, that is the country of UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., and even in the area of North Africa, both of which lack renewable water resources. But now the problem with these desalination plant is the brine. Brine refers to the high concentrated discharge which comes out from these desalination plants. Thus, any solution which has a high concentration of salt in water is called as brine. Now, the problem is that this brine is hyper salty. What we mean by hyper salty is that this brine contains 5% of salt concentration as opposed to the 3.5% salt which is found in the global sea waters. So, here you can understand that the salt concentration in sea water is 3.5%, but what is discharged from the desalination plants in the form of brine has 5% salt content and therefore is hyper salty water. In addition to high concentration of salt, this brine also includes antiscalants and antifoulants like chlorine and copper, which are used in this desalination process. And this chlorine and copper are again of a major concern because they are very toxic in nature. Let us now look at what exactly are the harmful effects which are caused by the brine. Across the world, most of the desalination plants are located just 10 kilometers from the coastline. Hence, 80% of this brine is produced around a 10-kilometer area from the coastline. Thus, it is very logical that most of this brine is discharged into the ocean sea, that too in an untreated form. Now, when this brine or high salty water enters the sea, firstly, it increases the salinity of the sea water. Secondly, it also adds extra toxins in the form of copper and chlorine into the seawater, thereby increasing their levels. Now, when the salinity of the seawater increases, it leads to depletion in the dissolved level of oxygen in the sea. That is, the amount of dissolved oxygen in the sea or the ocean reduces. This reduction in the dissolved oxygen level has a severe impact on the marine life, especially on organisms like crabs, shellfish, and other creatures throughout the food chain. Further, the toxic elements like chlorine and copper also have a very harmful effect on the fish, which then again disturbs the entire food chain and the marine ecosystem. Let us now look at some suggestions or way forwards in relation to treating this brine. Firstly, alternative sources of water should be explored. For example, instead of using desalination plants to have access to potable water, what we can do is that we can harness the aquifers which are located or are embedded below the seabed. Therefore, if we start exploring alternatives to brine, then the dependency on desalination plants can be reduced. Secondly, brine can also be put to some alternative use. For example, it can be used to irrigate all the salt-tolerant species of plant, for example, the spirulina. Further, brine can be used to generate electricity. Lastly, if nothing else can be done, efforts should be made to treat brine properly before it is discharged into the sea. That is, the large amount of salt or the metal which is contained in this brine can be treated and efforts can be made to reduce their content altogether. So based on our discussion, here is a prelims practice question. Please pause the video and solve it. We'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. With reference to desalination, consider the following statement. It is a process of removing salt from water. This is correct. Second, it is useful in treating scarcity of water across the globe. This is also right. Hence, the right answer is C, both 1 and 2. With this, let's move on to our next news. This next news is an editorial taken from page number 8, in which the author is talking that the government needs to come up with better implementation plan if they wish to achieve the objectives of the plastic waste management rules. From your UPSC syllabus, it will form a part of GS paper 3 under the category of environment and subcategory of conservation and environmental pollution. Now, though plastic waste management rules have been covered before in the DNS, but for better understanding of this editorial, let us again quickly revise them. The most important aspect of the plastic waste management rule is the extended producer's responsibility. As per this extended producer's responsibility, the producers, importers, as well as the brand owners of plastic have been given the responsibility to collect back the plastic which they are selling or producing in the first place. Hence, in a way, this extended producer's responsibility makes the producer or the importer of plastic accountable and responsible to collect that plastic back and then recycle it in an environment-friendly way. Therefore, the extended producer's responsibility establishes a collect back system of plastic. As mentioned, the onus of disposal and recycling this plastic now lies with the producers, importers, or the brand owners. Further, the rules make it mandatory to carry out alternative use of plastics, like using them in construction of roads and energy recovery. The management rules also talk about phasing out of multi-layered plastics in a 2-year time span, and in the meantime, it has called for ban on all the plastics which have a thickness of below 50 micron. Further, under these waste management rules, all the producers and importers have to pre-register with the authorities so that they can sell plastic, and further, they have to pay a plastic management fee to the said authorities. Lastly, the local bodies and the Gram Panchayat have been given the responsibility to look after the implementation and coordination of this plastic waste management rules. Now, in this entire article, the author basically points to two major problems. One is the actual implementation of these plastic waste management rules. And second, according to the author, the plastic which comes from food, cosmetic, or grocery, that is the plastic which is very commonly and locally used in day-to-day life, that plastic is still unaddressed. Now, the author in this article is suggesting certain measures or solution for the better implementation of these plastic waste management rules. The first thing which the author says is that municipal authorities should collect and handle this plastic waste in a much more efficient and proper manner. And related to the first point is the second point, that the state and the local governments have to upgrade their waste management systems if they actually wish to implement this plastic waste management rules. Because currently what happens is that state and local governments are very unwilling to take any kind of upgradation effort for this waste management disposal. And it is due to this only that the proper collection and the recycling of plastic is not able to happen. Thirdly, according to the author, as has been provided under the extended producer's responsibility, the government should take this very seriously and should charge producers properly. That is, it should not give anyone a free pass and should be very strict in its implementation. Related to the third point is another point. According to the author, it's actually the local and the small producers in the area which are facing ban or are facing charges. But the large MNCs or the organized entities are not coming under the radar of the government. Probably the reason for this could be since these local or small producers do not have the money to register, hence they face a ban. And second reason could be since they trade very locally, they do not have a proper mechanism to collect back plastic, therefore they also face charges. But when it comes to big companies or corporations, they continue to go about their business in the usual sense because somehow the government is not able to trace the plastic back to them. Hence, in conclusion, the author is saying there cannot be any kind of enforcement lacuna or lacks on the part of the government for proper implementation of the plastic waste management rules. Thus, in totality, the crux of this editorial was that the waste management system has to be upgraded, under which the municipal authorities or the local authorities should do their work much more efficiently and diligently. And secondly, the government needs to have a very proper implementation mechanism where it genuinely charges those people who are polluting the environment and not those poor local or small producers who though do not contribute much to the environment pollution but have to bear the brunt of the inefficiencies which exist in the implementation process. With this, let's move on to our next news. This news is an article which appears on page number 9 and is in relation with the Katowice conference. It will form a part of your GS paper 3 under the category of environment and conservation. Now basically in this article what the author is trying to say is that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was recently held at Katowice in Poland, has favored the developed countries instead of the developing countries in the final outcomes of this conference. Let us now look at the reasons which the author has cited for his apprehensions. Now the first reason cited by the author is the rollback in the different responsibilities. Now what happens is that under common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, also known as CBDRRC, it acknowledged that though all the countries in the world today are responsible for causing such global environment destruction, yet their contribution in this environmental destruction is not equal. That is, not every country is equally responsible for the environmental destruction, and therefore even the responsibility which has to be fixed upon every country to contribute towards climate action also does not have to be equal. That is, every country has a different contribution towards climate change. This principle of CBDRRC firstly recognized that there exists a lot of difference in the terms of economic development between the developed countries and the developing countries. That is, developed countries are much more economically sound than the developing countries. And secondly, it also recognizes the fact that most of these global carbon emissions which now exist in our earth are historical emissions which were caused by developed countries. Thus, based on these two acknowledges, it very logically means that there has to be some kind of differences in the contribution made by the developing countries and the developed countries to address the problem of climate change. But according to the author, under this Katowice meeting, this differentiation in responsibility has been further diluted between the global north and the global south. That is, between the developed countries and the developing countries. Now, though this process of dilution began in the Paris Agreement itself, where the developed nations were allowed to make voluntary commitments to climate mitigation in the form of intended nationally determined contributions, or the INDC. So, according to the author, in the Paris Agreement itself, when it was decided that the INDC would be applicable, then at that time too, you were putting the developed nations and the developing nations at the same pedestal. And there was no benchmark to ensure the relative adequacy of their commitment. That is, there was no benchmark to actually check that whatever they are committing, is that even adequate enough considering the fact that it was the developed countries who are much more responsible for the historical carbon emissions. So finally, the author says at Katowice 2, this differentiation between developing countries and the developed countries has been further diluted. Because what has now happened is that Katowice has come out with uniform standards of reporting, monitoring and evaluation for all countries, irrespective whether it is a developing country or a developed country. The second point which the author raises is in relation to the climate mitigation. The author feels that the developed countries are not taking as much interest or initiative as they are required to take in leading the climate mitigation. And the reason why he thinks so is that till today, all the developing countries continue to invest in fossil fuels, either by directly producing energy from such fossil fuels or by importing energy which has been produced by fossil fuels. Further, the author says, as per the International Energy Agency reports, the use of fossil fuel based electricity is continuously rising for the OECD countries. The third bone of contention for the author is related to climate finance. Now you have to understand that the developing countries in such conferences have time and again said that the climate finance would mean the transfer of funds from the developed countries to the developing and poor countries so that they can undertake projects for generation of renewable energy. So the stance of developing country is that this majority of climate finance should actually come out from public sources. That is, it is the government of that country who should actually give out climate finances. But what is happening? The developed countries on the other side are funding this climate finance not through public sources but through other sources of finance like the private sector flows in the form of FDIs. Further, the author also says that the developed countries, that is, are giving out this climate finance to the poor countries as a form of international loan on which they actually take the interest back from the developing country, hence diluting the concept of equity as far as climate finance is concerned. Further, the author also says that even the rule book which has come out in Katowice has neglected the concept of equity in climate finance, which was one of the main demands of the developing countries. Lastly, the author is talking about the difference between the global and unilateral actions against climate change. Now, the author says, in the recent time, it is the environmental and climate think tanks, NGOs, and environmental movement which are leading the charge against climate change. But now what has happened is that since most of these environmental NGOs or think tanks belong to the developed countries, instead of creating an all-around global pressure on all the countries of the world, they have started to individually pressurize developing countries to reduce their individual carbon emissions. Now think in this way. US is much more responsible for climate destruction than say Maldives. But these international NGOs, which usually belong to the developed countries, will pressurize Maldives in the same way as it would pressurize USA. And by pressurizing each country individually, what has now happened is that the pressure for global action against climate change has been very much weakened. because instead of calling out on all the countries of the world, these NGOs and think tanks usually target developing countries and tell them to reduce their carbon emissions. And this actually becomes very cumbersome for the developing countries, because imagine an instance where India, which is a developing country, actually has a lot of dependence on coal. But yet, these NGOs would pressurize India in the same way as it would pressurize USA, which if you see is much more economically sound to reduce its dependence from coal. So in this case, the author is saying that the global actions against climate change has been diluted because the unilateral voice by the environmental and climate think tanks is continuously increasing. Based on discussion, please try and attempt this mains practice question. With this, we come to an end for today's discussion. Let's move on to the question for the day.